Gnostic informant here with Myth Vision Podcast. This should be a good one. You and I, as devout Christians, would look to this Abrahamic story where Abraham was promised to, be the father of many nations. And of course, he goes to sacrifice Isaac. And I used to throw a little bit of my own little spin to the story and be like, oh, and he replaced it with a lamb. The story says a ram, but I would say a lamb. And guess what? It was the Lamb of God, which was the foretelling of Jesus' sacrifice. And Christians,
also, Isaac carried his own wood, just like Jesus carried his own cross.
Right. And
I have every Old Testament motif that's in the New Testament. I got it. I was there. I remember being that guy, ready to tell everyone about all that stuff.
And I mean, you sometimes a little tweak it just to really emphasize Jesus into it and stuff. But the point is there is a reoccurring mythical theme, not only from Abraham to Jesus, but that's when you're just looking at the Bible. We're going beyond. And I think it's interesting to note that you have found a source, and it wasn't just you, but it's like you're really bringing this forward. I think this is powerful because I just did that video on Phrixus and Isaac, trying to give you the origins of Abraham's myth. And there is a comparison between Phrixus, which is the son of Manasseh. I think it's pronounced Manasseh. He was the king who was promised a great land, just like Abraham was promised to be a great nation, okay?
Right.
And it's his long foretelling descendants who will then get that land. But in the meantime, his wife, their stepmother, hated them and tricked the dad, said, hey, Apollo, through the oracle at Delphi, said, you need to sacrifice your son, Phrixus, and Helle, or Helene, however you pronounce that. And he goes to do it, and a golden fleeced ram comes and saves them from being killed by the father. Sacrificed, and a deity sacrificial human sacrifice to this god. We love to go to the ancient Near East and see that at one point they did human sacrifice.
And they also have, in this city of Ur, have dug up a golden ram in a thicket. And that's where Abraham's from.
Yeah.
And they found that there. So it's like, there's a lot of stuff happening with this ram thing, but go ahead.
I love what you're saying there because it ties into kind of the whole Tower of Babel myth. I talk about this and I'm like, okay, we know that this is clearly mythological. In Genesis 1 to 11, scholars have recognized this. I'd go beyond that. I think the whole book of Genesis is mythological in nature. But they want to look at it, and some scholars are saying maybe people who traveled through the region of Mesopotamia at the time, maybe these authors, maybe Jews in exile or post-exile in the Persian era, they may have seen an abandoned, collapsed ziggurat. Okay, so if you and me were walking, we go, let's say we decide we're going to go over there to Iraq and see some of these locations. We're going to see abandoned ancient sites, right? Well, in their day, they were abandoned and ancient. So here they are creating a myth around this geographical spot with this tradition saying, see this massive building, this ziggurat, this was the tower to heaven. And guess what? It wasn't completed. You can see it's stopped in its halt. It's not completed. The myth of the Tower of Babel, some scholars think, is surrounding this particular abandoned building, and the mythos surrounding it is there. So my point about you saying this about the ram in a thicket in Ur is, we know this is in the Greek myths. We know this is in the biblical myths. I think they're later. Some scholars think they're earlier. Like, I think Hellenistic.
And the Greeks, it seems, were the best at preserving the knowledge that came from the ancients through not only the people that, who they call like the Proto-Greeks, like the Pelasgians, but also through the Hittites.
Right.
And the Hittites were writing in cuneiform, and they're connected to the world of Babylon. So that stuff is getting brought over to the Greeks.
Dude, Barossos. They would pay. They would hire the best of the best from all of the regions to just put it into their common language and Hellenize it. Yes. That's literally their job.
The stories of Pythagoras, the stories of Heraclitus, always would say they spent time in Babylon, they spent time in Egypt, and they're bringing this knowledge back to these Greeks. And so I guess what we're both trying to say is the Greek world and the Babylonian or Egyptian world, which in between that you have Israel, There's no fence off happening.
No.
This is a world that everything's connected.
They're all talking, and the myths are also
myths
compared.
are
There's
all
comparisons.
overlapping.
So this is where you discovered something, Neil, that when I first heard you say it, I'm like, dude, sometimes you wonder, like, here we
I got to check it for myself. This
Bro,
sounds too good to be true.
I was just about to say, like, Neil, where did you pull this shit up? I'm not gonna lie, like,
Right.
bro, you pulled this out of your ass, like, and then you're like, no, bro, I found a document that has really good reasons, and I was so skeptical even from the start, like, even as you were showing me, and you were like, that shows this very old thing that looks like Abraham, has circumcision, has the sacrifice of an only begotten son, all of this stuff, and it's
and you have the
ancient.
god El.
So tell us, who wrote about this?
So it's the same God that Abraham is worshiping, but
Right.
he's doing the stuff. So first, let me tell him
Let's
what's going
talk
on.
about this. Yeah.
Okay. Eusebius was a great historian. I don't care what you think about him.
He may have fudged stuff, but the guy really
He
tried.
was a real historian.
Right.
So if you ever read his text called on the preparation for the gospel, it is filled with citations of ancient sources. Every page is littered. If you really like ancient history and you haven't read that yet, that should be your next. Go do that next, because it's filled with knowledge,
Right.
and he's just preserving text that he feels. Eusebius. Here's what he's doing in this text. This is matters to what I'm getting.
Yeah.
at.
What's the context? Right.
What Eusebius is doing is he's looking at the ancient world, and he's saying what led up to Jesus. Like, what is because we know people in the time of Eusebius all knew that the Old Testament points to Jesus. You know,
It was accepted Christian.
Well, you and I know that these are great authors who are drawing from the Old Testament, like Isaac carrying the wood.
Right,
Like
right,
this,
right.
this is great literary motifs being drawn from.
Yeah.
As a believer, like Eusebius and other, they're thinking that these are prophecies pointing to Christ.
I need to add one caveat to this point that you're making that's so powerful, Neil.
Yeah.
You got the whole obvious. When I read my King James Bible a long time ago, it says the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old
Revealed.
Testament revealed. But here's what's powerful. By the 4th century, when Eusebius is writing his wonderful historiographical work, and he says, like, I've tried to find, this is where Richard C. Miller comes in and goes, dude, the first historian in the Christian church is Eusebius.
Yeah.
No one before that was writing histories or historiography.
He does a good job.
But this is the powerful point. Justin Martyr, very early on, had to deal with this very difficult thing. You and me have been trying to tell Michael
side,
Jones.
the philosophy side.
Bro, not just the philosophy, but the comparative mythology side, because Michael Jones and all these guys are trying to ignore this and don't want to see.
Okay,
Yeah,
real quick.
you get where this is going.
The difference between Eusebius and Justin Martyr is Eusebius is part of a world that's becoming Christianized, and he doesn't really have to worry about duking it out with the pagans.
Right.
That work's been done by Justin Martyr and
others.
Irenaeus.
Yes.
Now, Justin Martyr is living in a pagan world where Christianity is looked down at, and he has to duke it out philosophically with these guys.
He
has
has
to
no
deal with.
choice.
He has
Yeah.
no choice but to say, yeah, Mercury is also called the Logos.
Yeah.
Mercury is also the son of God.
Asclepius, sure. Hercules, sure. All
Yes,
these,
he has no choice but to deal with those texts.
because it's obvious.
Because it's obvious.
And so tell me if you think I'm going on the right hunch. Yes, there is this uphill battle with Justin Martyr origin early on and stuff like that against the pagans. By the 4th century, it's not an uphill battle, but
because
he's already Eusebius is reading the fathers.
this is in
before.
325 when Eusebius is writing this.
So he already accepts the notion there's comparisons.
Right.
He sees that the mythic world around is
That's-
foretelling Jesus.
You just walked right into what I was my point. So Eusebius is not only saying, yeah, the old prophets of Isaiah and the Genesis stuff points to Jesus. He's saying, but what if it's also the Greek stuff? What if it's also the Phoenician stuff? What if it's also Egyptian stuff?
The world.
What if it's Babylonian? He
Yeah.
is going everywhere, pointing to mythologies, pointing to philosophies, pointing to Zoroaster, pointing to this guy, pointing to this guy, and he's just filling in quotes and citations, and he's saying this points to Jesus because of this. Now, that's the text that is called
Origins, the gospel.
preparation for the gospel.
Right.
Preparatio Evangelical is in the Latin, or Greek, or Latin. This text is it opens up This is in the very beginning, chapter 1, book 1. He starts off with the Phoenicians. He wants to go back to the beginning. He's going back before Israel is even a thing. He cites a guy named Philo of Byblos who lived in the 1st century.
So from 4th century to 3rd,
right.
1st century.
But the text that he's citing from Philo of Byblos also cites a Bronze Age priest. I always get this name wrong. Sanko Nieton, I think it is.
Yeah.
Sanko Nieton.
Something like that.
But I put the name on the screen for you. Supposedly this guy lived right before the collapse of the Bronze Age, and his texts survived in temples in Byblos. That's why Philo of Byblos had access to this. Now, you don't have to believe it or not. Some people believe it, some people don't. In fact, I checked. I checked that what the scholarly consensus is. I actually thought the scholarly consensus is that this is
he made it
this
up.
is all made up.
Right.
But in fact, the scholarly consensus is that the sources or the Philo of Byblos citation seems legit. It seems like he Hellenized an actual text because the names of the gods that are in this text, it's a huge theogony.
Yeah.
By the way, a theogony is like if you know Hesiod's theogony. It's basically like a story of how the world came about, how the gods came about, the birth of the gods, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a big Phoenician theogony. And they mention, and the scholarly consensus is, well, Philo of Byblos seems to know a lot of these ancient Bronze Age gods that were forgotten about in his time.
So and just to add to that,
he wouldn't have known about these gods.
This is a powerful
unless
point.
He had an access to a source that actually went back this far.
So imagine a 1st century author named Philo of Byblos getting mentioned by a guy named Eusebius, who's very popular, and for 2,000 years almost, 1,700 years, we're sitting here going, and then we get into this post-Enlightenment skeptical age, and then all of a sudden we go to the actual Phoenician regions, we find the names of these deities which have been
That's what happened. Archaeology sort of vindicated Eusebius
on this point.
On this one point that these gods are Bronze Age gods.
Right.
Okay. With that being said, I have to throw this out there, but someone's going to get mad at me if I don't. The text has a euhemerus slant. That shows that this has to be post-Hellenization period. Right. Euhemerus coming from that period. So, Philo of Byblos, this is what the scholarly consensus is. Philo of Byblos had a text. He used it as a source, but he wrote his own new story. He didn't copy it word for word. He Hellenized and euhemerized probably maybe one source or multiple sources. Who knows? All we know is what Philo of Byblos wrote down is a 1st century text using sources that legitimately could go back to the Bronze Age.
And he could understand this language. So you understand
Phoenician.
He understands the ancient Phoenician language, just like Barossos could decipher the ancient, or Manetho could decipher the Egyptian
comparison.
Right.
Philo of Byblos is the Phoenician version of Manetho and Barossos.
Right.
For Egypt and Babylon.
Right. Manetho would have been Egyptian hieroglyphic, and Barossos would have been the Akkadian and the Babylonian and all that. Here you have a guy, Phoenician, doing the same thing just a few centuries after these people. And he Hellenized.
That is the perfect comparison.
Right.
It's exactly.
But they also Hellenized the ancient Babylonian.
Exactly. Just like Barossos Hellenizes the Chaldean stuff.
Right. But we don't throw them out and say,
no, we don't throw them out. We know that Chaldean, we know that when Barossos mentions this god name, not just Inanna, but what's
Kisithros. There's another guy named,
remember that one he mentions the god that comes out of the water, Oannes. He mentions these gods, Oannes, and this is all he's writing in Greek in the 3rd century. But it turns out that is Bronze Age stuff.
Right.
So there's so the scholarly consensus, there's no reason to think that Philo isn't doing something similar to this.
We're actually building up to a point, and you're going to see why.
Okay. Now that we have to lay that out first.
We had to.
So now you're asking, what's this text?
What is this?
Now that we know what the scholars think about it,
what does Eusebius tell us?
So the text is about. It opens up. This is by the way, all this text leading up to Jesus, he starts off in Phoenicia with a text called The Phoenician History by Sanko Nieton. And the story is El, who is equated with Saturn or Kronos. That's Philo of Byblos saying this.
Right.
Philo of Byblos is looking at a text that has El in it.
Elios or
Well, in Greek it's Elus.
Right, Elus.
The U.S. is just the
Right.
end of a Greek. That's how you
But
Hellenize.
El.
It's El.
Got
It's
it.
the god El. It's the Canaanite god El.
Ugaritic El.
And by the way, there's no other god named El. Well, it just means God.
Let's tell our audience this too.
Yeah.
Phoenicians are
Semitic.
more future Canaanites. So you have
Yeah,
the Canaanites.
it's the same people.
Same people, but you have this Bronze Age pre, which you would call Canaanite, and then you have Bronze Age post, and you could call
In fact,
those
they don't
Phoenicians.
call themselves Phoenicians. That's what the Greeks call them.
Right.
So they are Canaanites.
So they're
It's
just
Canaan,
Canaanites that just...
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
They're the purple people.
We're on the same page.
Okay.
Isn't it weird that these Canaanite Israelites ends up having this Abraham story? And
Right.
Like, oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of
So
myself.
here, listen to this. El, who Philo says, who we call Kronos or Saturn, sacrifices his only he says he arrayed his son in holy attire and put him on the altar and sacrificed his only begotten son. Those are the literal words he uses.
That's exactly
He sacrifices his only begotten son to his father Aranos, which is heaven in Greek. But he actually does the sacrifice. There's nothing stopping
Right,
him.
nothing stop, and that's why in Jewish lore, I think Abraham does kill Isaac.
Right.
But
Which actually makes you think this is older, because there is a Hebrew scholar, and I just forgot his name, Shucks, I wish I remembered it. Simca interviewed him, and this guy said that there was a time in ancient Canaanite history where sacrificing a firstborn would have probably been happening.
oh no, there's several. Kip
Yeah.
Davis, Matthew
Okay.
Munger. We also got
So this is going back to that.
right.
So El sacrifices his only begotten son to Aranos as an offering.
And real quick on the Greek side, just to give them,
But there's more.
I want us to take this piece
All
by
right.
piece because you're mentioning names Saturn. You're mentioning which is Kronos. You can
Yeah.
say, or at least they have correlation because
Yeah.
Saturn ends up being a son of Kronos.
And by the way, the Sabbath is on Saturn's day. You know, might be
Right.
something there too.
In that myth, you also have Kronos eating his children, or going to kill he's trying to kill his children. So there's a sacrifice taking place here. I just want to mention that because why would he Hellenize it and make that the deity? Well, look, you got a god killing a son. You got a god killing a son in the Greek one. Is it because they were two disparate myths, or is
Right.
it because there's a common
But
source?
before we get to the Abraham thing, so right now you're probably thinking, okay, that is interesting. There's a big difference though. Abraham doesn't actually kill his son. Where's the golden ram at? All that stuff's a good question. Here's what makes it more. Makes you think Abraham, because in a couple of passages later, El circumcises himself and makes it a right for all males on their 8th day to be circumcised from this point forward, that everybody from the Phoenician clan had to do this.
Right.
Who in the Bible, it's Abraham that does
Bingo.
that. It's not Isaac, it's not Jacob, it's not Moses. It's Abraham who starts this the circumcision rite.
Right.
So now you have, if it was just the sacrificing his only son thing, that might not be enough.
Right.
But when you combine sacrificing your only son with this is a very specific thing, circumcision. This isn't just it's not like everyone in the world is randomly doing this. You have two different distinct things happening in the text. Sacrificing his only son and then circumcising himself.
Right.
Then now you're looking at a text that is passed down in the same geographic area,
Right.
in a
Phoenicia.
Semitic language,
Right.
with the same god El.
So you have a Semitic language, same god, El, which is found in the Bible and in this. You've got a circumcision.
Abraham's sacrificing for El sacrificing for heaven.
Right.
So it is kind of weird. It's
It
like
is a little bit
a
different.
succession happening
Well,
there.
we've talked about this whole succession of deities too, and I don't want to rabbit trail, but the idea that Yahweh is a descendant or one of the sons in the theogony of the biblical text, it's kind of there, but it doesn't spell it out clear because they want to. There seems later that all of this material is coming together in the Hellenistic age, but it seems like Yahweh is a descendant of El. But I've asked the question: was El a son of a god as well? And I imagine he was.
He was.
So
Aranos, yeah.
Here you have this ancient Phoenician, ancient Canaanite, and all scholars consensus say the ancient Israelites were Canaanites. So we have the source, and here's Eusebius in the 4th century AD after Jesus trying to reach back, building up And this means he's cooperating with the idea of the Greek myths also having.
So he gives his commentary on this text. He doesn't just write it and just leave it there.
Yeah.
He gives his commentary. He says he has a commentary on this text. He doesn't just tell you the story and then move on to the next story. He gives his own opinion on why he's adding this to the preparation of the gospel. So what Eusebius says is, such then is the character of the theology of the Phoenicians, from which the word of would be the logos of salvation in the gospel teaches us to flee with averted eyes and earnestly seek the remedy for this madness of the ancients. It must be manifest that these are not fables and poets' fictions containing some theory concealed in hidden meanings, but true testimonies, as they would assume themselves of wise and ancient theologians, containing things of earlier date than all poets and historians, and deriving the credibility of their statements from the names and history of the gods still prevailing in the cities and villages of Phoenicia, and from the mystery celebrated among each people, so that it is no longer necessary to seek out violent physical explanations of these, since the evidence which the facts bring up with them of themselves is quite clear. Such then is the theology of the Phoenicians.
So real quick here, this is a really interesting
and
point.
He brings, and there's another commentary in there just above that where he says the only begotten son being sacrificed.
He goes
is the myth of the world.
Right. And what's interesting, at the beginning of his topic on this, he points out the Phoenicians and the Egyptians were the first people who brought up the deities, all this stuff, which we've now know Sumerians really played a significant part in that. Right. But it's really interesting point is he makes it sound like this is what actually happened. So I want to give my little commentary on this. We see the connection of him clearly making correlation to Abraham, first circumcision. We see it with the only begotten son, human sacrifice. We see this is clearly pointing to the gospel. What is the gospel? Jesus Christ crucified. But I want to take a modern stab at this and point out something. In that neck of the woods at this time, they thought that was a good idea. Many Christians today think, yeah, Jesus had to come and die on a cross and blah, blah, blah. But like we see this as mythology now.
Right. It doesn't, it's like, it sounds bizarre. It sounds ancient. Like in the time period, we're not that far. We're a lot closer, I should say, to the times where sacrifice
of humans
was
real.
Something that people thought was
They thought it was the best thing for the gods.
A real thing that's actually helping.
You even
like Greek Alexander romance. Before he goes and battles Darius, he gets a ram or whatever, a bull, sacrifices it, checks the entrails. The priest comes and looks at it and says, "You will win this war." Right. Like that is Alexander the Great.
Right.
Doing this, like this is.
But before that, there were times when it took a human.
Yeah.
And in fact,
right.
Yeah, it wasn't just animals.
Humans,
they needed a human, and a human was the highest version of sacrifice you could possibly give to a god or gods. And you could see this. Go check out Candida Moss's book on the myth of persecution. She goes to the Greek world, and I can't remember the woman that they ended up sacrificing, but the king in Troy, I think it was Troy, one of these cities ends up promising the gods the sacrifice of his daughter. She comes thinking, he calls to her and his wife thinking she's coming to marry like Achilles. Turns out, no, at the last second he says, "I'm sorry, but I promised to sacrifice you to the gods." She then turns around in the narrative after everybody cries and mourns her death because she would never be married and have children and stuff. Then she says, "Father, do what you promised the gods." Kind of like what we see in the book of Judges, where you have this promise to El that, he's going, or Yahweh, I can't remember which deity particularly in there, but he promises his daughter, he promises whoever walks through the doorpost, his daughter walks through and goes, "You have undone me." Then he has to sacrifice her. She says, "Just give me 1 month to mourn my virginity, and then you can do what you got to do." Like, that was common. And I guess what I'm getting at is, from an ethical modern standpoint, I'm not judging the ancients.
Right.
I'm making a point. Can you imagine literally today thinking this is the literal truth, and you're talking about killing a human being as your sacrifice? Like, look, I'm trying to make a point.
It's wild.
Trying to make a point, yeah. And the fact that they have a sacrifice yourself or human sacrifice is like a real
It reminds me
thing.
of that meme where they were like, we need a virgin for the sacrifice.
Right.
And all of a sudden, everybody's just a huge slut. Like, oh, yeah, it ain't me. I just got like 10 dudes last night.
Yeah. Like, it's just funny that
Yeah.
you can see this is dated. And
Yeah.
why aren't we looking at this as mythology? Chronos and
But
and El.
do you realize how much of a good point you just made? Because if even I think a modern Christian today would probably think those stuff is dated. But wait a minute.
Yeah, your whole theology.
Your whole theology, and Eusebius points this out very clearly.
Yes.
Is
Rooted in ancient
rooted in that.
Canaanite.
The sacrifice for your sins comes from this type of stuff. Like you can't sit there and call other things dated unless.
So look at I wish
just
we had
saying,
a
not
Christian, reaction.
Yeah.
All right, watch this. We pull up that show, Apocalypto, right? That movie, my favorite little Indian we call it Indian, but you know what I mean. Apocalypto with the Native Americans and what happened when Mel Gibson did that, and then you see them carve the heart trying to get the solar eclipse to happen on the top of the Mayan temple. You have this pyramid, and they literally kill human sacrifice, right? And they go, how archaic, barbaric. No, dude. This is exactly what you guys are pretty much doing in saying Jesus' death is the human sacrifice that appeased my wrathful, vengeful God who's going to take it out on me.
It's so true.
It's so primitive.
Yeah. Because, look, we started this off. This is coming back full circle perfectly.
Yeah, it is.
We started this off talking about how the Old Testament points to the New. We know that's the great authors, by the way,
yes.
drawing back from this Old Testament and making this story about Jesus. Well, they're drawing the concepts of the burnt offering to the Lord, the Passover meal, right? The Yom Kippur sacrifice for the sins. Those are the concepts that are being placed on a Jesus. And Christians don't do those things today because the last sacrifice is the last, that's all. But that doesn't mean, so what you're saying is, all that stuff is real and valid, and you're saying it's working, but Jesus replaces that.
Right.
So it's like, are you not saying this is primitive? Because I don't know where you're at with that. Like,
oh, it's very.
I don't know if that made sense or not.
That's why I
but
said if they looked at Mayans doing this 400, 500 years ago on pyramids in South America, and they go, "What barbaric kind of people is?"
Well,
this?
I've even heard Christians say Jesus put an end to all this, archaic nonsense of burnt offerings. Why did they have to do it then?
Yeah.
Why did God like it so much? That's the God.
Yeah.
You're saying God's ideas aren't good? You're saying God had to change his mind?
From day one, human sacrifice.
What are you saying? What are we saying here?
And we see elements left over in the Deuteronomic law and other places in the Bible where the firstborn child, you're supposed to give the firstborn son as an offering to the Lord. It literally says as an offering to the Lord. Here's the thing though. You see them change this because in the same context, it talks about your firstborn male bull, your firstborn male sheep. Like, what does that mean? That meant sacrifice them. But instead, they found a way where they could pay for the firstborn male. They could give here's in replacement of my son, here's some money to the priest and to the temple and to the cult so that they don't have to kill them anymore because they probably started going, hey, this is not, but